Welcome to the Mobile Hunter Podcast, and this is the Whitetail Apprentice Series. I am your host, Josh Luck, and I am joined by two co-hosts on this episode, Chris Leppert and Rick Cates. Fellas, how you doing?
What up?
Doing well. Happy to be here.
Yeah, Rick is our special guest co-host because he didn't have the chance to hop on any of the episodes last season for the Apprentice Series. So
I got on one. The one we did with Jeremy Aaron.
Oh, that's right. Yes, you were on one.
Yeah.
My apologies.
I wish you cared more about Rick and remembered him.
So for this episode, so the last one, we had Chris on talking about early season success and efficiency during the early season, and we're going to expand upon that in these upcoming episodes. And I kind of wanted to kick this off with kind of focusing on early season buck movement and buck bedding in the early season. That is something we hit on with Chris in the last episode. In order to help us do that, our guest today is Mr. Luke Resop. Luke, how you doing?
I'm doing good.
Great to have you back on. I know last time you were on, it was Sklenner and I chatting with you, and we couldn't wait to have you back on. It was a great discussion.
Good. Yeah, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Are you getting any sleep? You got the new little one?
We're slowly starting to transition into hopefully a period of our lives where sleep is increasing because the last few weeks have been kind of rough.
I hear you. I got back recently from a trip over the weekend. I went to a bachelor party. We went whitewater rafting. And it was an overnight. So we were camping and stuff. So not a lot of sleep. I come back and my toddler wasn't feeling well. So I had fallen asleep for like an hour and a half, woke up because my toddler had woken up crying. So console him, get him back down. And then I slept for another 2 hours. And then my 7-week-old woke up wanting fed. So I did that feeding. And then I just started my day.
Yeah. I've been amazed at how, I guess, adaptable my sleep schedule has been for the last, decade of my adult life. I've been very kind of regimented, in bed by preferably 9 o'clock, up by 5. And that's just kind of how I operate. But that has completely gone out the window the last few weeks. And I'm, honestly, I'm surprised at how well my brain and my body have been adapting to it.
It can be surprising. Our first one wasn't bad. This one is a little different. My body can't seem to adapt to it quite as well. I'll get some nights where it's like 2 hours, 3 hours. I feel fine. Next night, same amount or a little more. And then I feel worse. And it's like, my body's still figuring it out, but we'll get there. Chris is just chuckling over there. He's like, I've gone through all this. I'm good.
We had 2 littles during the shutdown. It was hell on earth. And my kids aren't quiet in any way. They don't sleep great. They do now, but it was a rough time.
Yeah.
Character building process.
It was rough.
We digress. So back to the main reason everyone is here, right? We're going to focus on early season buck movement and buck bedding. We're going to go over the buck movement study that you guys did. Has it been released 2 years now? 3 years?
Oh, we started that project back in 2016, and the main chunk of it was 2017, 18, and 19. It's been several years.
The publication came out after that, though, right?
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. So we're not going to worry about breaking down the study as far as like methods and how it was conducted because we did that previously in other episodes. So for those that are currently listening, we go into the buck movement study, specifically breaking down rut and buck movement during the rut in episode 214 with Luke. So if you want to learn more about his background or listen to that specific episode, it is there. In episode 205, we kind of break down the whole study in totality with Dr. Bronson Strickland, and then that is a good listen as well. But for this episode, we are specifically looking at early season time frame. Just making sure I got my spot. Okay, so for those listening, I highly encourage you going to our YouTube channel, the Mobile Hunter, because we're going to go through different slides and stuff and kind of compare early season graphs and stuff to some of the movement you see in later seasons. So I'm going to go ahead and try and share this here, and we'll just start kind of breaking things down. Okay, can you guys see the screen?
Yep.
Perfect. Scroll down here. So like I said, we're going to move through all the methods and how it was conducted because we went through all that. Unless, Luke, you have any specifics you would like to preface some of this conversation with, feel free to do so.
I don't think so. I think if there's anything like that, we can kind of dive into it as we go.
Yeah, but understand. But I think we can definitely do that. There is later on when we get into net displacement and total distance, right? We'll think that's an important aspect to dive into, but we'll get into that a little later. So first, before we start this, I do want to hear from Chris, because we had Chris on last episode. So over the past handful of years, Chris, you've really dove into the early season, and that is more your forte compared to like the rut time frame. So why do you feel like you have more efficiency during the early season compared to like a rut situation? I'll give my perspective, and Rick, you can give your perspective after as well. I got a really good taste of this last season that I kind of want to hit on, but I do want to hear from you first, Chris.
So I think it's really interesting because when you get into those opening weekends, there's been probably a little lack of pressure, even though I think there's probably more pressure than we think. When we talk about people showing up 2, 3, 5 days ahead of time, like we did in Nebraska, for example, to scout. Some people aren't scouting with glass. Some people literally go out and hang trail cameras a week prior or whatever. So I get that. But in spots that I like to look for, there's generally going to be a lack of pressure. And then when you continue past that first week, there almost seems to be an enormous drop in almost any kind of pressure, because you get through like opening week, the opening 10 days, we'll say, and then everybody leaves. And they're now waiting until October. Everybody's scared to death of the lull and everything. And really, that's a solid time, because if you find a deer, you're probably going to be able to hone in on him quick. Now, for me, early season generally is going to come down to the thermals are significantly easier for me to read. There's a lot better contrast between above the canopy and below it. And then when you involve some form of ditch or, water of some sort, generally running water, you're going to have the ability to not only slip in and out unseen. A lot of times, especially using water access, you get in and out of there super clean, and you're able to control those thermals. And not only do I feel like I can get in and out and control where my scent's going, but I also feel like I know exactly what a big buck, a mature buck, is going to do according to how those thermals are moving. Because in my opinion, they live and die by the thermals in places with terrain.
What about in terms of, because I know you've said this to me, especially when the year you killed your big buck, right? And things didn't quite go as planned for the early season, then you got later in the season and almost in panic mode a little bit, right? So as far as locating and determining movement patterns and stuff like that, what are your thoughts early season compared to later in the year?
You generally you're going to run into a lot more of that native browse, which is opportunistic in my opinion. They've got literally everything they could ever want, and on top of that, most people don't hunt it. Everybody wants to go sit on the edge of a gorgeous lush bean field that's about to turn yellow. So I live for those meadows and anywhere where you've got that open canopy. I've invited you multiple times now to Glass, one of the places I hunt that has probably the best consistency we've ever seen. And we watch deer walk through beans to eat the wildflowers on the side of the road, and we just crack up. But they still nibble the beans and everything. They still eat them. It's just, I think when you have all that diversity like that, there's a lot that keeps those deer there, holds them in there.
Yep, definitely agree. And that's a topic we discussed in a couple episodes from now as well, that we recorded, and just something that we hit on pretty heavy during this aspect of the series, this early season time frame. I'm going to give my perspective on this a little bit because I feel like I got hit right in the face with it last season, and then Rick, feel free to throw in your thoughts as well. But I think what became really evident to me last season, and as we've been diving more and more into the research, I think it really aligned with what I was seeing as well, which is part of the reason I wanted to have Luke on and go through this. There is a difference between hunting just a buck in general and hunting the buck, a specific buck. And last season, for example, did a bunch of scouting for early season to try and make quick strikes for various reasons. One being, right, we're dads here, right? We have little ones and our time is limited, so we want to be efficient and make quick precision strikes, so to speak. So I was able to hone in on these deer in certain areas in the early season, and then once we got to rut, their movement rates increased, right? They dispersed, they were moving more, not as localized into some of these areas where we specifically target, kind of like what you were saying, Chris, the areas that have open canopies or that habitat diversity, right? That they tend to like or may have a higher fidelity for. But it just became very evident to me that hunting a specific buck can be more difficult in the rut time frame because of how much they're moving. You have different does coming into estrus and stuff like that. So that is something I really want to hit on here, because a lot of people like to hunt the rut. A handful of years ago, rut was by far my favorite time to hunt. Now, not so much. Now that I'm kind of transitioning a little bit more into hunting certain quality deer, just because that's what I like to do. My how I view things has shifted in my head. I'll still hunt the run. I still enjoy it, but it's early season. I have found more consistency and movement, and it has become almost more enjoyable than actually hunting during the rut. So that is my perspective on it.
It's depressing to know once you learn that a buck could push a doe into an area and not leave for a day or two. I mean, that could be 2 to 4 sits that you put in and not seen anything at all, or seen a bunch of little guys, and you don't have him on camera, and he's dead, and we're all going to die. The world's ending. Like, that's how your mind works. So, I'm in agreement. It's depressing.
Yeah. Rick, you primarily still hunt the rut, right? You have your vacation, you do your camp with your family.
Yeah, while I do early season in Kentucky, because I really don't hunt Kentucky during the rut a whole heck of a lot. Most of my hunting is done during the rut, and it is it's eternally frustrating, because if you have all the early season picks, you have all these things, you put together a plan, you think this is what's going to happen and this is what's going to do. Last year I threw kind of just all that out, and I hunted it like a completely different area, and I found deer, went out, sat in the middle of a rainstorm, deer were chasing. And I think that when you get into the rut, like, you can just throw your playbook kind of out the window. Like, the movement's there, but it might not ever be where you were at, because those bucks have changed their locations based off doe feeding patterns or a doe coming into estrus. What I have come to learn in hunting more early season, and really since moving to Kentucky in general, is that all the opportunities that I had in Ohio that I looked at, in November, I had to change. Like, you have to look at a lot more native browse. Why are the deer here versus being over there? You can bait still in Kentucky, but you're not going to get the quality deer. My experience has been I have not gotten quality deer and how I learned how to grow up hunting. I had to change and do things a lot different. And as Chris said, living and dying by the thermals has been an absolute game changer. I passed a deer last year that he and I put a plan together on, and on a west wind, this deer, 3 deer were supposed to be in there. 2 of them showed up, and I passed both of them. But it was simply because having that ability to look at like where they're going, how they're doing it early season was completely different than them chasing does, through a rut funnel in the fall.
Yeah. Luke, I'm trying to remember. We talked about it a little last year. When do you primarily like to hunt? Are you mainly like a rut guy? You also hunt a lot of public.
Yeah, I'm completely opportunistic. When I get the opportunity to be in the woods, I'll be out there.
There you go. As are most of our listeners, right? Time is precious, and when we get an opportunity, we go.
Yeah, and I guess to elaborate on that a little bit, because I hunt almost exclusively public, I'd say 90 to 95% of my sits throughout an individual season are on public land. Because I hunt almost exclusively public, I'm rarely targeting an individual buck. I'm just trying to hunt buck sign, and I'm trying to hunt where I believe there are multiple bucks. And because of that, and like what y'all were just discussing, my opportunity and the likelihood of encountering any buck, doesn't have to be an individual, but any buck, is by far the greatest during the rut time frame, when bucks are moving around all over the place. So if I had to choose when I was going to hunt, it would be that, pre-rut to peak rut time frame. But there are certainly things that I love about hunting early season. A lot of that does have to do with predictability, especially when I used to hunt a lot of private land. I very much enjoyed hunting early season, and especially having a lot of either visual observation history with a buck or trail camera history. I completely agree with what you were saying a minute ago, Rick, that when you get to the rut, you might as well throw that playbook out the window. Are there still consistencies and things that you can bank on? And, if you have history with a deer, that you can kind of predict what he's going to do from one year to the next? Yes, there are absolutely consistencies there. But when you go from the before the rut time frame, so September, early October in y'all's neck of the woods, when you go from that, when deer aren't really thinking about breeding yet, and they're still kind of on that food cover pattern, which we can get into more in a minute, they tend to be very predictable. And that kind of hangs around until, you get to late October, and a few things start happening in that late October time frame. Several things start happening. The first does start coming into estrus, which throws a wrench into their patterns. Forage availability on the landscape starts changing, which throws a wrench into their patterns. You go from having depending on the area of the country you're hunting, you might have hundreds of acres of green soybeans in August or September, to October. Now they're turning brown, and the combines are running, and those food sources are changing. Mix that in with a bunch of oaks in the forest that are all dropping acorns. And I totally agree that by the time you get to mid-October, you're not even hunting the same woods or the same deer as you were just a couple weeks earlier. The playbook completely changes.
Yeah, there's the amount of variables increases as you get closer to breeding and all that. And like you said, predictability is tougher, which is something that we're going to hit on here. And I think the data definitely supports that. So with that, let's go ahead and get into some of these graphs and that. I'm going to re-share here. Okay, you guys see this?
Yep.
So I'll put the publication and everything in the show notes. That way people can easily get to it. Again, you can see this on the YouTube channel as well. But let's go ahead and just take a look at these two figures here, figure 3 and figure 4. Looking at daily total distance traveled changes with month, and then daily total distance traveled changes within the rut phase. So Luke, do you mind kind of just discussing some of these differences we see from this early September, October to, later when we get into breeding?
Sure. Yeah. So the first thing I'd like to point out here is that this study was conducted in central Mississippi, and our peak breeding season is about 2 months later than what most of the country is going to experience. So, where y'all are at in the central US or the Midwest, most of the peak breeding activity is going to be early to mid, maybe late November if you're in a strange little pocket, but it's pretty much going to be concentrated in mid-November. In our neck of the woods, where the study was conducted, and in much of the deep south, peak breeding activity occurs in the second half of December and trickles into early January. And that there can be huge variability there. Just in Mississippi alone, we've got parts of the state where we've got peak rut occurring in early November. And then if you go down to deep south Mississippi, it's mid-February when our peak breeding is taking place.
Wow.
So I just wanted to say that to kind of put all this in context. When you're looking at these graphs, especially the daily total distance traveled, that is relative to our peak breeding season. All of everything we're going to talk about, for the most part, is relative to when peak breeding is taking place in the landscape. So if you kind of focus in on that left-hand graph there, you see that our daily distance traveled in terms of daily yards is relatively consistent in September, October, and November. And then you see this huge bump in December and January, and then it kind of drops off in February. That's because our peak rut occurs in December and January. November is still pre-rut for us, whereas for the rest of the whitetail world, November is peak rut, and in parts of the whitetail world, parts of November are even post-rut. So when a lot of what I'll be talking about and some of the movement data that we'll discuss is from our bucks in the October timeframe. Now, October for y'all would be, especially late October, that's going to be, smack dab in the pre-rut when there's a lot of scraping going on, a lot of, that early seeking and chasing going on. The first does are going to be starting to come into estrus in the second half of October. But for us, that is still well in the pre-rut, like before really any of the breeding is taking place.
Yeah.
Now contrast that with the graph you see on the right-hand side, and those 5 rut phases that we see: pre-rut, early rut, peak rut, late rut, and post-rut. Those are all 2-week intervals that we broke down the data into. So pre-rut, when most hunters talk about the pre-rut time frame, they're talking about roughly the 2 weeks right before peak breeding takes place. When we talk about peak rut, we're thinking of a lot of scraping activity. We're talking about a lot of bucks running around the woods like crackheads looking for the first does that are coming in. When we put pre-rut in our context, that is before that takes place. That is before most of the scraping starts. That is, right on the very onset of any of the rutting activity. And then early rut is that kind of 2 weeks prior to peak rut. And then we've got the 2 weeks surrounding peak breeding. And then late rut is the 2 weeks after peak breeding. And then post rut is the 2-week time frame, essentially after 95% of the breeding has already taken place. And as you can see, daily total distance follows a very typical bell curve like you would expect, where total distance traveled is greatest in the peak rut, and it really starts to bump up in the early rut. So the take home with all of that is the specific months that we're looking at, September, October, November, those aren't necessarily what's important. With these graphs, it's how those time frames correspond to when peak breeding takes place. You can expect to see these same curves take place wherever you hunt. The same patterns will exist, just where they occur in the calendar will change a little bit.
Yeah, that's a really good breakdown for our Midwestern friends, right? If you're looking at this figure 3 here and it gives these months, you would just shift this back a little bit, right? But looking at it from these 5 different rut phases here is a good way to think of it, because it kind of takes this general time frame out and just looking at those 2-week intervals. But one thing to note here, and like we said earlier when we were talking about some of the predictability, right? If we look at this daily total distance travel changes with month, we can see bucks are still moving here. You're getting from, what's that, let's say 3,750 yards a day, all the way up to 4,000 in this early season time frame here, kind of the no rut, the pre-rut, and then you get this huge jump in the movement here. And we see the same thing here as we get closer into early rut and peak rut. We get this big bump of movement, which can make predictability tougher. So that is kind of what we were discussing earlier.
Josh, do you remember if anywhere in this publication there's a net displacement graph?
There is. It's on.
Okay.
Do you want me to go to it?
Yeah, I just think that's an interesting talking point when we're talking about this stuff. Yeah. So if you look at this, the graph on the right-hand side here, where total distance traveled is in green and net distance traveled is in maroon, I really like to look at this and kind of break this down because I think it tells us a lot of interesting things about predictability and where a buck spends time at a given time of year. So when we think about total distance traveled, if you imagine a buck's path throughout the day that he's traveling, he might be squiggling around. He might start here and go in a very circuitous route all the way to his final destination, wherever he ends up at midnight the following day. If you follow that exact path, that is his total distance. But his net distance is just going to be straight line distance between where he started and where he ended. So if he walks in a perfectly straight line, total distance and net distance will be the same value. But let's imagine he gets up inside a 5-acre bedding area and walks around all day long, but ends up in the same exact spot. His total distance traveled might be a mile, right? Because he walked a mile worth of steps, but his net distance would be zero. So we can kind of tease apart some of these buck movement patterns by comparing total distance and net distance. So that's the background on kind of how we quantify all of these things. The interesting thing about the difference between total distance and net distance is if you look going from October and November for total distance into the pre-rut, we kind of start to see this stair-step movement where total distance increases all throughout the early phases of the rut and then peaks during the peak rut. So bucks are moving the most, they're taking the most steps throughout the day during the peak rut relative to any other time of year. But now there's kind of a subtle thing going on here that I think is very interesting. Their net distance is actually peaking during the late rut. So what my interpretation of this, and I think there's a lot of data to support this, is that they are spending the most time moving and traveling the most, taking the most steps during the peak rut time frame. But once those, once the 50%, 75%, 90% of those does have already been bred, their net distance starts to increase and they essentially start to expand their search radius. I think that's a good way to term that. So they go from spending most of their time in 500-acre area and they're bouncing around all through it. But then when you get to the late rut, that 500-acre area, it picks up and moves to a different portion of their home range because they are now expanding their search radius and trying to find new areas. So that's why when you get to the late rut time period, that is when a lot of hunters will start to encounter bucks that they have not seen before or they haven't seen since the previous year. It's because these bucks are now kind of picking up and expanding their search radius in search of does that have not been bred yet. They've kind of, depleted the breeding resources in the area they've been spending time, and now they need to go spend time somewhere else. So, I know we're kind of focusing on the pre-rut time frame here, but that late rut time frame can be an extremely effective time to be in the woods. By that time, a lot of hunters have already gotten burnt out. By the time you get to early December or late November, early December, especially into late December, a lot of hunters have either already tagged out or they're tired of being cold and wet and hungry, and it's time to be in holiday mode and spend time with the family. But that late rut time frame, and in the context of most of the whitetails range, late November into early December can be a phenomenal time to be in the woods and capitalize on bucks that you haven't seen before, haven't seen in an entire year.
Yeah, we that episode, in episode 214, we really dove into that aspect. I remember us talking about it. There's actually a clip on our YouTube It's titled "Is Late Rut the Best Time for Big Bucks?" Right, and just for those reasons that you talked about, right? Because you always hear about those guys like around here. It's usually around kind of Thanksgiving, maybe a little after. They see some of the biggest bucks that they've seen all year. They haven't seen in a while, and that kind of gives credence to that.
Yeah.
This figure 9 here is actually one of my favorite figures in this article, just because I think it shows things so well. If you're just looking from a movement standpoint, the total distance and the net distance, right? So if we're looking at this October, November pre-rut time frame, if you're in Kentucky, right, and you have a first Saturday of September opener, right, you're probably looking more of this October, November time frame here on this graph, right? That's what we would be looking at here. But from this, their net distance is very small, right? If you're looking at yards traveled per day, the average here is 450, 475 yards distance. Total distance traveled, right, is still around close to that 4,000 yards. And same if you go like a month later, just a small tick up, not much difference at all. So from a hunter standpoint, if I was to utilize this information, it tells me that they're still moving quite a bit. 4,000 yards is quite a bit over a day, but they are in smaller areas, right? The net distance is small, so they may be more. We'll get into focal areas here in a little bit, but they may be, have a high fidelity for one area or be in these focal areas a little bit more, which again, I think if we're looking at predictability, when we get into the peak rut and late rut, and then their net displacement is much greater, right? And just an example, like, they could be these 20 different locations, whereas if you're looking at early time frame, well, now they're maybe in these 5 different locations, right? Those arbitrary numbers, there's no data behind that. That's just to give an example there. Okay, so let's go back up. So we looked at figure 3 and figure 4. The next thing I had on here, we jumped ahead a little bit on some of my notes. Luke, this is one of the reasons why I like to have you on so much. It's like you read all of my notes beforehand, but I know you didn't because I made them right before.
I'm very squirrel ADD sporadic.
We were going to get into all of that. So, I mean, it's as we're going, we're just going to hop into things. I like this. So moving on down the article, looking at figures 5 and 6, we're not going to get into moon data and moon phases and all that. I plan to do that in an episode later on, and when we get into that more October timeframe, because that's when more people are a little concerned about it. And MSU, right? They just last year, right? You guys released all that data, the moon data. Has that publication been made available on the MSU website?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's out. I will double check that, but I'm almost positive it's been published.
I don't remember if I found it. I know Bronson sent it to me. It was like right when it was finished. We were talking to him. He's like, "Oh, actually today we got the publication," and he sent it to me, and I was like, "Oh."
Yeah. It's titled Lunar Legends. Does the moon influence buck activity? So there's kind of a hint on whether or not the moon actually influences buck activity. Lunar Legends. Well, my favorite, we kind of went back and forth with different potential titles for that, and my favorite variation of it was Lunar Table Fables.
Yeah, we'll dive into that in a later episode. But I do like these graphs here because it still shows some of the same things we were just talking about when we're looking at buck movement. So if we're looking at figure 5 here on the left, right, looking at daily distance traveled in yards, that no rut time frame, you can see it's pretty low, fairly consistent for daytime movement, right around 1,000 yards for daily travel until you start to get to that pre-rut, and then it ticks up, and then same bell curve we saw earlier as we get into peak rut and into the post that drops off some. But this is just another good representative of showing the movement again. And if we look at figure 6 here, average hourly distance traveled by bucks. So if we look at this day timeline here, this like orangish color, the hourly distance traveled in yards, it's floating right around in the no rut time frame, right around 100 yards, and then it gradually ticks up in the pre-rut and then peaks in peak rut.
Yep.
Just another good visual. Okay. So moving on to figure 7, hourly buck movements by rut phase. I also like this graph because of the different lines it gives. So it gives like a little line graph for no rut, pre-rut, peak rut, and post-rut. So for our conversation for this podcast, we're kind of really focusing on no rut, pre-rut. And again, average distance movement per hour in yards. And this is over a 24-hour time frame, correct, Luke?
Yeah, yes, correct.
Yeah, if we're looking, so I'm assuming 0 would be like midnight and then 1 a.m., 2
Yep.
a.m. Yeah. And this shows that corpuscular movement here. You see these peaks and valleys here. So you get a peak around, was that around 7 a.m. that would be? And if we're looking at this no rut line graph here, and then again around 6, 7 p.m., you get another peak in movement.
Yeah. So one of the interesting things about this graph, and we can take this a lot of different directions, but think about hourly buck movement rates. So if they are moving a lot less in a given hour, what's the alternative? They've got to be doing something if they're not moving. They're either bedding or they're feeding or they're just standing there watching for, a predator or a hunter or whatever. And when we look at the no rut time frame specifically, so in y'all's neck of the woods, that would be, late September into the first half of October, maybe the first, 3 weeks of October. They are spending a lot less time moving than they are at other times of year.
Mhm.
And a lot of that is because they're still spending a lot of time foraging. They're still spending a lot of time eating. But they're also spending a lot more time bedding. If you look at our bedding data, which I'm guessing we'll get into in a little bit,
Yep.
They are spending the most time bedded and using the most most beds during that time of year. So their bedding habits are absolutely more consistent during the no rut time frame than they are at any other time of year. They're, generally bedding in a more confined area, so they have fewer distinct bedding areas during the no rut time frame. So that means that their bedding areas are going to be more predictable. And very often their food source is going to be much, much, much more predictable during the no rut time frame than it is at other times of year. So I don't know if you want to get into the kind of some of the food cover stuff now or later, but there's a lot we can dive into with that.
Yeah, if you want to dive into the food cover stuff now, because I was going to hit on it anyway, and then we can move into the bedding if you like, because we're kind of hinting around that as well.
I got a question
Yeah.
about that when we get to it, so remind me.
Which, the bedding or
The bedding.
Okay.
Yeah, so I've gotten all fired up about some of this food cover stuff lately. I don't know if y'all saw just yesterday, we made a post on some of the food cover patterns that we see in our mature bucks. When we sit down and really comb through some of the early season movement data for our adult bucks, for our mature bucks in our GPS study, we see some really interesting things related to this food cover pattern. I'd say the food cover pattern, you hear hunters talk more about that when you're in an early season buck movement conversation than anything else. They're talking about how bucks are more predictable during the early season because they're on a food cover pattern. And there are a couple of different things I think we need to discuss on that topic. One, there is certainly some truth to that. When bucks are in the early season, some bucks, now there is an immense amount of variation among individual bucks. So take all of this in the context of which individual buck you're hunting. Some bucks, they are on a really strong food cover pattern for a couple of months prior to the rut really kicking off, and they will have an extremely distinct bedding area. And that might be, I mean, that bedding, I use bedding area very loosely. That bedding area is very often dozens or even hundreds of acres in size, and it might have beds scattered all throughout it. And he visits each of those beds sometimes 1 or 2 times. Oftentimes he'll have, you know, a little hot spot of beds that he comes back to repeatedly. But this bedding area could be, you know, many acres in size, but he will be in that bedding area, and every single day, with very few exceptions, he follows the exact same travel corridor to some destination food source. Oftentimes it's a large soybean field or a large clover alfalfa field. If that's not in the area, or even sometimes if it is, he will travel to an old field with a very diverse native plant community and be foraging on, you know, native species that are very diverse. And that is something that we consistently see in our movement data. And some bucks are more prone to do that for whatever reason. Now, you will go right next to that buck's home range, and there will be another buck that is the same age. All the factors, as far as we can tell, are very consistent. And the second buck will have the same access to a soybean field or an alfalfa field or a clover field or whatever, but he is not on that food cover pattern. He's just not using the soybeans like the other buck is. And generally, when you find a buck that is not on that food cover pattern, his budding habits are a lot more sporadic. He's using a larger area of the timber. His beds are more evenly distributed throughout that patch of timber or old field or whatever he's at, and he's a lot harder to predict. One of the other really interesting things I think about some of the food cover stuff is when bucks are on that food cover pattern in the early season, it is highly dependent on food availability in their summer home range. So let's say we take, and we see this repeatedly, let's say we take a buck that's 4.5 years old, and it's the fall of, let's say, 2017. And in his summer home range, there's a, 100-acre, 200-acre soybean field. He will be, bedding in a patch of timber, maybe half a mile away from that soybean field. And every day he is making a straight line movement back and forth to that soybean field. And his travel corridor connecting that soybean field and his bedding area is extremely well defined. So much so that if you were sitting there, I mean, you could almost cover the entire travel corridor within bow range. I mean, 30 to 50 yards, certainly. Now, the next year, let's say that soybean field is now planted in corn, or it's left fallow, or for whatever reason, it's just not a destination food source anymore. That pattern completely disappears, and he does something wildly different. He might shift his home range somewhere else. He's not shifting his home range, but he is now using a different portion of his home range, and he is no longer traveling to that field because it's not there. It is actually quite, I'm trying to think of an example if I've ever seen this. And I don't think I can. It probably happens, but we've got over 60 bucks collared, and we've got an immense amount of movement data. Many of these bucks were collared for multiple years, and I cannot think of a single example where this happened actually. But for whatever reason, if a buck in year one is using a certain soybean field, traveling back and forth a lot, and then year two, the following year, that soybean field, and I'm using soybeans as an example. It could be clover, it could be alfalfa, it could be any destination style food source. If the second year it is no longer planted in that forage species, I can't think of a single example where he shifts to another soybean field. It's rare that he goes to a different one. It's almost like, and I'm talking, it's not like he's going to shift a mile and go to a different one. If that first soybean field isn't planted in soybeans, he's probably just going to spend more time foraging in old fields or foraging in the timber. It's not common that I see them just absolutely up and move their home range to accommodate another destination style food source for whatever reason. I don't know why that is, and I'm sure it does happen on occasion, but the majority of our individual bucks that we look at, they have pretty high fidelity to an individual food source. Now, flip that on its head and look at it the other way. If you have trail camera history or observation history from the stand or whatever with a buck in year one, and he is routinely visiting a given destination food source in the early season, and that buck makes it to the following year, and that destination food source is there the following year, you can bet your bottom dollar that he is going to be back at that same field the following year. Their patterns from year to year in terms of this I'm talking early season now, not necessarily in the rut time frame, but their patterns from year to year in the early season, when the really high quality forage resources remain consistent, their patterns remain incredibly consistent. I'm talking within hours or days, they will be in the same spot from one year to the next. And they are typically very, very predictable. And that's not just with forage resources in the early season. We see this a lot with some of our mobile personality bucks, that they kind of have these different home range segments, and they travel back and forth between them sometimes multiple times per year. Oftentimes, let's say take buck 140, for example. Buck 140 is the one that we collared him in Mississippi, and a couple months later he swam the Mississippi River, and he was 18 miles away in Louisiana. We had a collar on that buck for 2 years, and we've 30% of our bucks kind of have this mobile personality, so I'm just using buck 140 as an example. In year one, when he swam the Mississippi River, that occurred when he came back from Louisiana. That happened sometime in mid-August. It was like August 13th or 14th. Year two, when he was coming back from Louisiana again, it happened he came back across within 72 hours of when he did it the previous year. We have other bucks that when they make these long distance movements between their home range segments, it is literally within 24 hours of when they did it the previous year. They have this incredibly fine-tuned internal clock, probably regulated by day length at some level. But, I mean, very consistently, when bucks are making these, especially long-distance movements, they are within, 24 to 72 hours of when they did it the previous year. And I have seen that firsthand, not with GPS data necessarily, but on trail cameras. I'll have a buck on camera, and, I had him on camera in early season, and then he disappeared in middle of October, and I assumed he got hit by a car or he got shot by a neighbor, and I just never heard about it. Don't see him all year. And then the next year I see him on camera again within a few days of when I saw him on camera the previous year. So the way these bucks kind of navigate the landscape from year to year, and the important point here, I think, being when forage resources and bedding resources are extremely consistent, is very predictable. And we can get more into that with some of the habitat management stuff. But, when you've got good history with a buck in the early season, and for whatever reason, he slips through your fingers and makes it to the next year, if you can make sure that the food resource that he was using is there the following year, you can bet your bottom dollar that if you're in the right spot, he will be traveling that same travel corridor again to get to that food resource the following year.
I'm really glad you brought this up. The habitat aspect of that, what you were just talking about, Chris and I dive into in a couple episodes from now. We dive into that a little more with Dr. Mark Turner and Marcus Lashley. But that is that aligns a lot with what we see. A lot of times, these early season areas, we're focusing on habitat diversity. And there are some management areas that do a really good job of it, and in different states where they may cut, they may burn, and all that. And what we've found over the years, it creates more consistency rather than you're just in hardwoods where there's no diversity, right? And sometimes the predictability is tougher. But you get in these areas, like you said, that have consistent bedding cover, have consistent forage, high quality forage, right? The predictability is there. I know Chris has an example of those cover to food movement patterns as well. He's got a really good example of a buck he's after now, and then I got an example of it. There's a deer. He wasn't even on my radar until I got him on camera 4 weeks ago now, maybe a month or so ago. He was in the same area he was last year. I figured I'd have a picture of this deer. He popped up, and I was like, that's a big deer. Like, wonder if I have him from last year. And I went through the pictures, and sure enough, I did. And he made about a 30-inch jump. He wasn't even on my radar until I saw him this year, and I was like, holy cow, that's a good deer. But he's in the same area it was last year. I even told Chris there's like this 20-acre patch of woods where I think is like what he likes to use. Part of this is, I think there's a couple of different things there. it's an area of very high pressure. So I think the pressure dictates them to that 20 acres I'm talking about is probably the best cover in the area. So he likes to stay there. But also there's very consistent food sources there. There's some private ag not far away. Last year there was a lot of corn. And you go a little further and it's beans, and then it flip-flopped this year. Now the beans are a little closer, corn's a little further, but there are a lot of old growth fields as well. So very consistent forage, very consistent cover. And where a lot of the cover is, I think that's where a lot of the hunters don't go. So the predictability, I think, is much higher for that deer. I'm hoping I have a pretty good chance at him. But Chris has an example of a buck right now. Do you want to talk about that deer, Chris?
Yeah. So are we talking about Kentucky or Ohio before I go any further?
Ohio.
Okay.
The deer we glassed up, and you feel like it's the same one, and
Yeah.
he always disappears about the same time. And
So this whole I've killed way bigger deer than this, but if I kill this deer, it'd be very special to me. I started hunting a specific piece of public back in like 2021. And when I first went to put up cameras, pulled the cards, checked them, and I see this gorgeous 8. And you know right away looking at him, you're like, you're 3. Here in the Midwest, you got to let that guy go so he can reach his potential. So I nicknamed him Hard Pass because he's the one that literally makes you hate yourself. And I actually ended up killing a smaller deer that I think was younger even that year. I could kick myself for, but I just got so excited. It was a rut hunt, and he did everything that I thought a mature buck would do. He looked like he had a big body, and I walked up and about threw up. But anyway, I saw this deer on my first sit in 2021. He came through and walked directly underneath me, could have spit on him, filmed him for a while, and watched him mosey on out to the destination food source. So the following year, I had a few different bucks in a bachelor group, and there was one that I had glassed up, and he was very unique. It was super tight rack, but he was the biggest deer out there, period. He was extremely mature looking, I guess you would say. And I told Josh and our buddy Pierce and Rick, I'm like, I don't think I can pass that deer if he walks by me. Well, wouldn't you know it, that deer is one of the first to come by me on opening day. So I shot him. And right after I shoot him, he ran 40 yards, died. And I'm on the phone with Josh. And I'm like, hey, I got to go. There's more deer coming down. And out walks that 8-pointer again on my first sit of the first weekend of, Ohio's deer season. So the following year, I don't see this deer at all. And I end up killing my best deer. And then last year, we find him. He's there again, but he's got a broken G2. So I'm like, man, if that hangs on, maybe we'll try to target this guy. Well, of course, it fell off. So I'm like, maybe next year. And now here he is back again. I think this would make him a 7.5-year-old deer, which I don't care who you are. To me, that's cool. And especially if it's on public land, I'm finding that I'm actually able to pass these deer and watch them year after year after year. I killed one in January that Josh and I had watched in 2023 in the summer. And it's the neatest thing. So it's very interesting though, because that deer, after the first time I see him, I'll never see him again all season long. I won't be able to glass him. I won't see him during a sit, and I will not have that deer on camera. Now, I'm not going to say that this deer just isn't really good at avoiding everybody, but I don't know. He's got somewhere that he goes where I can't see him.
Yeah. So what food source is he going to when you see him in that first weekend of season?
Name anything that exists. There are grasses. There's all kinds of ag. There's corn and beans. There are acorns down in there that are dropping to the white oaks. I mean, there's literally anything, and then there's fields full. I don't know how much the forbs are a thing that time of year towards the end of September. I don't know if there's still much of anything, but there's a lot of stuff. There is so much food for him to eat in all the deer. So there's a lot.
Yeah. Well, we very consistently with our movement data see that kind of summer to fall range shift. For us, it's happening in, the late October timeframe generally.
Sure.
But I wouldn't be surprised at all if that's what's going on. Maybe, like you said, he is just very good at avoiding you or avoiding other hunters after you see him the first time. But I wouldn't be surprised at all if he's just up and moved to a completely different portion of his home range, which might be hundreds or thousands of yards away from where you've been seeing him.
Yeah. That would be interesting. Just kind of a perfect timing with his own little shift.
Yep.
And wow, that'd be kind of cool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and he gives you one chance at him, and then he's like, if you don't capitalize on opening day, I'm gone.
I'm going to scare the shit out of that deer this year. He had better not give me another chance because we're going to capitalize.
Something that I wanted to ask you, Luke, and Chris and I have chatted about this before, and I think we hit on it in a later episode. People listening are going to get tired of us hitting over on the same thing, but it is what helps us find bigger deer and more consistency. But in relation to like the shifts and stuff, I feel like for the most part, again, it depends on the buck's personality, but for the most part, the areas where there's some habitat management taking place, and there's a lot of habitat diversity, it seems like those home range shifts happen a little later in the year. A lot of people worry about that initial shift, especially around Ohio. There are a lot of things that are changing. Ag is turning yellow and stuff like that. Bucks have lost their velvet and all that. So like that end of September, very beginning of October timeframe is fairly tough. However, I found in certain areas, and sometimes it's some of the more mature deer, where they have everything they need, they tend to stick around a little longer and give you a little bit more opportunity at them before you get to like peak breeding it when the movements may be a little bit more erratic. Have you seen any of that in some of the data?
Not specifically. But it's kind of difficult for us to quantify some of that with the way we do these analyses.
Yeah.
And the habitat data that we have access to. So I have not seen that specifically, but if I was a betting man, I would say that I'm sure that happens, especially with some percentage of bucks. Now one of the talking points with that is, while some of those range shifts from summer range to fall range are undoubtedly, like you said, I think this depends greatly on individual buck personality.
Mm-hmm.
While some of those range shifts are undoubtedly in response to changing resources on the landscape, like they're shifting from summer range to fall range when the summer forage availability is dwindling and fall forage is coming in somewhere else. So that's why the shift. I think if you were to implement good habitat management practices and a lot of diversity to provide them what they're looking for summer and fall in the same area, I'm sure for some bucks you could keep them around longer, if not potentially indefinitely throughout the season, and prevent that range from shifting. However, what I will say is that from our movement data, it seems that once a buck has a pattern in place, like if let's say his 2.5 or 3.5 year old year, he makes a shift, you can bet he's going to make that shift the following year. The deer, in a lot of ways, I think, are creatures of habit. And when they find something that works for them one year, a lot of times I think they're going to do a very similar thing the following year because it worked the previous year. You know what I mean? They didn't die. They were able to find does, whatever the case may be. And this is just completely speculation. I do not have any data to back this up, other than, some correlations, but it's not causation, certainly.
Yeah.
But I bet if you implemented these habitat management practices and had buck fawns and yearling bucks grow up in an area with the habitat diversity, and they had the cover types that they needed to meet summer forage demands, fall forage demands, cover in the summer, cover in the fall, doe bedding areas, all of those things, I think that you would have a much greater likelihood of those bucks sticking in those areas through maturity. Whereas if you have a 3-year-old buck in an area and he's already got an established pattern going back and forth between summer range and fall range, and then you go in and do a bunch of habitat management and provide him, various resources that would meet his demands, because he's already got an established pattern, I still bet he up and leaves and goes somewhere else. And the reason I say that is because every time we've never done a manipulative study like this, but I think it'd be fascinating to do.
Yeah.
But every time that we've got a buck in year 1 and he's got some kind of travel pattern that he's doing from point A to point B between different home range segments, he always does it the next year if he's still alive. I mean, he never doesn't do it. Now, the reason I say it'd be interesting to do a manipulative study, we've never actually gone in there after he's, has these patterns that he displays year 1. We've never gone in there, done these habitat management practices, and seen if we can manipulate his movement behavior in year 2. My bet is that we couldn't, or at least not to the extent we'd like to. We might be able to delay it by a couple weeks, but I bet you he still leaves.
That'd be a very interesting study.
Yeah, it would.
Yeah.
Reminds me of Thomas. You remember when Thomas's dad bought that farm?
Oh yeah,
He had that buck on camera, like literally it just lived in front of his Tacticam. And then he started going in, planting all these apple trees and all kinds of trees and putting food plots, and the buck left.
He changed the landscape quite a bit. Now he may not have shifted far. He may have just been avoiding that area. We know these bucks are very good at avoiding pressure, right? But yeah, that was interesting to see. Going back to your point, Luke, of these bucks that find what works for them and then they kind of stick to that pattern. And another layer to that, and again, this is just anecdotal evidence from what I've seen over the past few years. It's may not be causation or anything like that, but I feel like in areas that do a good job with some habitat management, and different states do different things, they have different resources and funding available to them, but there are states that do a really good job at managing certain areas, whether it be select cuts, burning, different stuff like that. But also, a lot of the states will advertise this, and then you get more hunter pressure on the landscape in many of those cases. However, I mean, that does deter some people, and I would much rather hunt a non-pressured buck if given the opportunity. But if I find a mature buck, we're talking 4 or older, a buck that has survived in an area of high pressure, that also has good habitat for him to provide the resources that he needs, I get very excited, because I know he has found what works for him and he will stick with that. So if I'm able to break down whatever pattern that might be, and so it depends on the buck's personality. Like we've talked to Jacob Sklinner, who was on a giant deer in Wisconsin, ton of cover in this area, but also lots and lots of hunting pressure. And the way that buck survived was he was very mobile. He moved a lot. Other bucks become, in my experience, a little bit more sedentary or have higher fidelities to certain areas where they don't get touched by the pressure as much, or it's harder to hunt. But I get excited in areas with good habitat management and very high hunting pressure, because if I find a mature deer there, there's a good chance that he can be very killable if you just figure out his pattern, what's working for him. So I just wanted to throw in that perspective there.
Well, I'll give you an example of some data that I think perfectly backs that up. So as part of our study, we not only put GPS collars on all of these bucks that were taking locations every 15 minutes. We've got very fine scale movement data all throughout the hunting season. We also asked the hunters on the properties where we were collaring these bucks to keep track of their hunting efforts and how much they were hunting. So we've got hunting pressure data in terms of, it's kind of hard to quantify exactly where a hunter was and where his scent was blowing and which deer smelled them and how they responded to it. But we do have a pretty good index of how much an individual property was being hunted. And I'm thinking of an example on one property that was one of our heaviest hunting pressure properties. It got hunted, more hours were spent on that property by hunters than just about any other property. And I'm thinking of a buck that was on that property in the early season. And on this property, there is a large ag field, what I'll call an ag field complex. Okay. So there are a bunch of smaller ag individual fields that are bisected by drainage ditches and fence rows and little blocks of timber. These blocks of timber are 1 to 5 acres in size. And there are a number of bucks that on this really high hunting pressure property, they spend almost all of their time in these little blocks of timber out in the middle of these giant ag fields. And all of their movements during the daytime, at night, they will be out in the middle of the field, kind of moving around through the middle of the field. But their daytime movements are exclusively restricted to these really narrow fence rows and drainage ditches. I mean, and I think the reason for that is because on these really high hunting pressure properties, people are not hunting a 10-yard wide drainage ditch. They're not hunting a 1 acre patch of timber out in the middle of an ag field. And why is that? Because it is freaking hard to get into without busting deer. But that's where those deer are hanging out. And if you can find a way to get in there very carefully, you have I think those are excellent areas to hang cameras. Because why? Because they are by far the best funnel for deer movement on the landscape. Because you go from a wide open soybean field where if a deer stands up, you're going to see him from 5 miles away. And you run a 10, 20, 30 yard wide drainage ditch through it. And that is how deer are going to navigate. That's their only option to navigate in the daytime without being seen. And if you put a camera in there, as long as you hang the camera with the right orientation, you are going to get every single deer that walks through that strip because it's so thin. And if you can get in that area and successfully hunt it, I think that is by and large one of the best ways to capitalize on that early season buck movement when there's a lot of food in the area and there are these little, very commonly overlooked either patches of timber or drainage ditches or fence rows or whatever that are bisecting these ag fields.
The drainage ditch theory is lovely. That was actually the reason that I made the noise I did when you were describing everything. I don't even care about the ag. It's the drainage ditch because it's a thermal advantage.
Yep.
It's a low point with where, the thermals, especially on a light and variable day, which we see a lot of in the early season, that stuff will flow just the way the water will. They'll come in there and check the whole damn ag field by hitting that ditch. It's depressing to actually think about, but what's funny is access, just as you described, is a living nightmare. You're pretty much limited to, if you don't duck walk or crawl in there, you're probably going to get busted.
Yep. I just want to throw up this figure here, figure 22. We had discussed this last year too, but it gives a good kind of a visual of how some of these bucks will avoid pressure and just kind of go around it. Right. So that is a very real thing, and it does happen very often.
Yes.
So we'll go back.
So a little bit of context on that. I spent, 5 minutes ago talking a lot about how consistent buck movement is from one year to the next when resources remain consistent. And I think that is true when you consider buck movement at kind of a macro scale, a 500 acre to 1,000 acre scale. Like their home ranges and their big movements between area A to area B tend to remain very consistent from year to year. But I think at the micro scale, they absolutely will fine tune their movements in response to things like that, to stands that have been hunted, to a sudden change in hunting pressure, like especially on public land too, certainly, but private land, you get to about this time of year and what starts happening on public land and private land. Everybody and their brother is out there hanging cameras and hanging stands. And I mean, bucks absolutely key in on that. And they might not, their home range isn't going to up and move, but they're absolutely going to use their home range differently.
I can think of a set of pictures that I have of a deer, and it makes sense with the bed to food thing we were talking about earlier. This buck would show up October 22nd at between the hours of 5 and 8 p.m. And he did it for 3 straight years. Big, beautiful deer. Stopped, and it was coming into a corn pile. But every time he came in, the picture you would get was he was looking directly uphill where a ladder stand had been put. And that deer would stare there. You get one shot at that deer, and if you weren't there, you wouldn't see him. Now, we had a camera probably a quarter mile away, like in a little bit of a native food area. That deer was in there regularly through that time. But coming bed to food on that spot, he would do that. But getting in those private areas, and I think that this is why, getting into mobile hunting is ultimately very important, is that you allow yourself so much more opportunity in those times. Because, I think Dakota Cantrell on here a few years, was it last year you guys had him on?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
He had talked about when he started doing that, he got away from those ladder stands, and it was amazing how much more you could get on those deer, so much easier on those patterns when they exist.
Yep.
100%. Going back to the buck I had talked about earlier that had grew, like made a 30-inch jump in that. So this is a really good example. That small 20-acre patch of woods I was talking about, right? It's exactly what we were just discussing. It's in between all the pressure. It's hard to get into, hard to hunt, and if you don't do it just right, like, you're going to blow a lot of the deer out. So a very good example of that, and it's in a small overlooked spot near some easy access, and I've found that in other states as well. Just these small overlooked spots that are hard to hunt or don't look like they have they're easy to hunt, so hunters are kind of not going there. But then you hang a camera in there, and boom, there's multiple shooters in daylight. I had an example last year. It was just 150 yards or so off of a main gravel road, and I had 3 different shooter bucks in there in early October hitting a scrape in broad daylight. And I was like, well, son of a gun, they're just those little spots right there. They're just avoiding the pressure and still moving. There was another point I wanted to hit on, and it has eluded me.
Welcome to my world.
Yeah, I think it was in relation to the trail cam placement, Luke, that you were talking about. Those are good areas to hang cameras. So that buck I was talking about, when I first relocated him this year, I'd actually gone in to hang cameras and I bumped him. He was in an old growth field eating, foraging at almost 9 a.m. And I turned and looked down the wood line and saw him briefly, and I instantly knew he was a shooter. He took off in the woods, ended up hanging a camera over there. It took some time, but I did get him on camera. It was dark. It was like 5 in the morning. And then a week or 2 later, I got him on camera again at it was broad daylight in the morning. And I was like, all right, I am close to where you like to be. That camera died, and I went in a couple weeks ago and changed the batteries and moved the camera, because the camera placement I had, things had grown up in the field. It wasn't a very good spot. So I tucked back into that small patch of woods where all the cover is. There was a small opening in there that I had walked once during the off season, and I had found some sign in there. So I made a mock scrape, hung a camera on, and once you know it, boom. That evening, I got that buck on camera an hour and a half before it got dark. And then I hung another camera like 500 yards or so away, closer to some of the ag. I got him on that camera the next morning. And I was excited at first, because I was like, oh, this is awesome. I got a travel pattern. Like, I got bed to feed. Like, this is going to be great. And then directly after that, and I was messaging Chris and Zach Kaiser about this, I was like, or he has just smelled everywhere I went, and now he's going to avoid that. And he hasn't been on camera since that day. And he's probably just avoiding the cameras. He's still in the area, I have no doubt about that, but he's probably just meandering around those cameras and stuff. But it is amazing how quickly they will adapt to human intrusion, especially in high pressured areas. They're so attuned to it.
Yeah, y'all have y'all been keeping up with the whitetail research guy doing the drone stuff?
Yeah. I have. I'll talk to you about it off air because I have my own,
Sounds
my
good.
own qualms.
Yeah, I also am going to do a study where I take pictures of deer and I just have a deer on the screen and then whatever I say is fact too, but go ahead.
We can discuss it later.
I won't go into anymore.
Yeah, I think the observations are interesting and something to take note of, but you have to really put some of that in context and perspective when you're doing that. My issue is classifying it as definite research because I come from I have a clinical doctorate in physical therapy, and then when I hear someone that's a personal trainer,
I'm a learned doctor.
someone that's a personal trainer reiterating some of the same information and calling it the exact same, there is a difference, and people don't understand that all the time. So
Sure. And I share a lot of the same apprehensions as you do with some of that stuff. What I was going to mention about that in relation to your previous point was the most recent video he put out where he hung 5 cameras or whatever in an area and then flew the drone up and looked at, he got like 20% of the deer that were on camera. Wait, no, 20% of the deer that he saw on the drone were actually on camera.
Yeah.
And I think that is very telling for a couple of reasons. One, because cameras are obviously not getting pictures in a 360-degree orientation. They're very limited. But two, how does, your scent on that camera influence, or scent around that camera influence where a deer decides to travel? I think that is a very informative little chunk of anecdotal observation, that just because you have a camera in an area and the deer isn't on it doesn't mean the deer isn't in the area.
Right.
100%. We have found that a lot. And if I have a buck on camera, especially if it's even twice, if I have a buck on camera that I'm after twice in daylight, I know he's around that area way more than I think he is, because it's such a small area that your camera is focused on, especially during the early season like we're talking about. Like that buck I was just describing, I had him on camera 3 times and I bumped him once. That tells me he's using that area a lot, because there are other deer I've targeted where I've got on camera less and I was able to get on them quickly in the early season. So
and so let's take a minute to dive into some of this camera placement stuff. Certainly the most predictable in general, this is going to vary between different bucks year to year, but in general, the most predictable time of year for patterning a mature buck is going to be in the early season. I have no doubt about that, because they're just on, typically, like I said earlier, there are exceptions, but they're typically on more of a food cover pattern. However, even when you are in the early season, when they tend to be the most predictable, let's take a buck, for example, that has a relatively well-defined bedding area. Maybe it's 50 to 100 acres in size in a patch of timber, and then he's got his favorite destination food source. Maybe that destination food source is 500 or 1,000 yards away from his bedding area. That is not uncommon at all. They're often many hundred yards away. It is rare to see a deer that is bedding on or in the chunk of timber that is directly adjacent to that food source. I don't know why that is, but they very often are hundreds, at least, yards removed from their food source. They save a lot more energy by bedding right off the food source, but for whatever reason, they're very often hundreds or even thousands of yards away. Even when that is the case, they are still traveling in a relatively well-defined travel corridor, but it is often, depending on the landscape features, but let's say it's, kind of patchy, early successional areas and timber and maybe some other ag fields and food plots, their travel corridor between bedding and food is still going to be very often at least 100 yards wide. They're not using a single trail back and forth. I can actually think of 1 or 2 examples where I've seen them use a very specific trail, but that is really only in cases where the landscape is only conducive to concealing them on that trail. Like there's a lot of people's yards and, large pastures and whatever. So they kind of have to follow a fence row or a thin strip of timber. When they have the option, I mean, they almost never follow a really specific trail. So if you have a camera on a really specific trail, he might be walking in the early season. He very likely is walking within a couple hundred yards of that camera every single day, but you're probably only going to get him every week or two on that camera just because he's 20 yards to the right, 100 yards to the left, 80 yards behind. So that's kind of in the context of the travel corridor between bedding and food. Now let's talk about if you've got a camera in his bedding area. Even in the early season, when our research has very clearly demonstrated that bedding area consistency is more consistent than it is at any other time of year, he is still all over the place. I mean, he has got movement patterns and beds all over this bedding area, just dots on a map, sometimes over at the smallest, a 5 or 10 acre area, but oftentimes 50 to 100 to 300 acres. He is bedding all over that chunk. And if you've got a camera in there, if you just so happen to get it on one of his favorite areas, you will get, a dozen or more pictures of him, but you've got to be on the X for that. More often than not, even if you've got it on where he consistently travels, you'll still only get a picture here and there because he's 20 yards to the left, 20 yards behind. They're not, I mean, it's not like they're just traveling the same path time and time again. They're upslope, they're downslope, they're on the ridge, they're in the bottom, they're using a trail on the leeward side, on the windward side. I mean, they're using a landscape in a very dynamic pattern in relation to all sorts of things, hunting pressure and thermals and wind and food sources and where they're heading and where they're coming from. And it's just, I'm a believer in trail cameras to some extent. I think that they can certainly tell you if a buck is in the area, but they cannot tell you if a buck is not in the area. No way.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think that they're basically just a small piece to the puzzle. I think they're very, very valuable, but they're a piece to the puzzle. And if you just think you're just going to go stick cameras up, man, your odds aren't very high. You got to be able to scout and really get that For me, I like to find the beginning point, which is about where he's going to be bedded and where he's going to be headed, and then just connect the dots along that line and pray to God that I've got a line of travel, which in a place with terrain, it's a little easier than it is in the flat. It's probably near impossible where it's flat, but it's tough. They literally will come from so many different directions. I never feel like they're on a very specific trail for the most part. They just walk wherever, which I think if you ever pay attention, every single deer story you've ever heard with a big buck, I heard a stick break. I think they break the sticks because they're walking where they never walked before.
Yeah.
Trail cameras are a tool, and I do think it's a hard transition. I mean, it's still a struggle when I hang cameras sometimes, and like I said earlier, maybe if I only get a buck a couple times on there, I have way more confidence in the early season that he's sticking around there more so than what I think he is. But it's hard to kind of get away from that and go based on just your scouting and all of that stuff and your woodsmanship. You're constantly trying to work on that, but it is hard for people to be like, well, I don't have him on camera, he's not here. But you got to realize it's such a small area, and the odds of you getting him on there all the time are fairly low. There are certain instances where you can get him more than others, but that's why people like to hang cameras on licking branches and stuff like that. It'll focalize some of the movement, but it can be very tough to kind of get away from the trail cameras. I've had to learn to do that over the years and rely on my observations, my scouting, and all that. And I think I've gotten better at it. And I know Chris does the same thing, and Rick has been working on that same thing. I know he's gotten better at it, but I have my confidence in when I'm receiving pictures of bucks in the early season, my confidence that they are sticking around there or maybe just off camera is way higher than as we get later in the season. Like if we're getting starting to get into breeding, we're getting to that for here, this time frame, late October into November, right? It's my confidence that they're still in the area is much lower.
Yeah. Hey, can I share my screen real quick and give you an example of what we were just talking about?
I would love that.
Okay, so this is very typical of what we see in the early season when a buck is on a food cover pattern. Up here in the upper right-hand corner, this is a destination file style food source, and he is. I mean, you can see he's spending some time bedding in here and here and here, but a lot of his beds where he's spending a lot of his time are over in this area. This distance right here, his quote unquote travel corridor between his where he's typically bedding and his food source, this is about 500 yards wide. Now he's obviously crossing right in here a lot, but even still, that's still 80 to 100 yards wide, even right there.
This is phenomenal to see.
Hanging a camera and trying to catch this buck, for example, going between cover and food, I mean, you're going to have to be pretty well right on the X. If you get it right in here, you're going to get him a lot, but you probably hang a camera here and you get him one time and be like, oh, he was just passing through. He's not in this area anymore. In reality, he's here all month,
499 yards the other way.
Yeah.
But that is a great visual
crazy.
example. And I think along those travel corridors, if people are thinking of this of like, okay, how would I hone in on or possibly hone in on that area where he's moving a little bit more in that travel corridor? I think from our perspective, if we're hunting like public and stuff, like people talk about the fresh sign, right? I think for early season, when you get into like whip rubs and things like that, I think those are some areas where you'll start to see some of those whip rubs pop up because they're traveling through there a little bit more often. You're starting to get some velvet pop off, and they're just starting to make early season rubs. I feel like those are the areas where I'm usually seeing whip rubs. Chris, do you feel the same?
I would agree. Man, that's so cool to see. I'm still like taking it all in there.
Yeah,
that's literally something that proves everything that we've thought.
Yeah, I mean, that's how you talk to or the buck that you missed early season a couple years ago.
Yeah.
Right. That's essentially how you found that. But that deer shifted slightly, right?
Yeah.
He was still in the same area. And you figured he just made a micro shift because of some of the pressure. You found a trail with some whip rubs and fresh sign, and sure enough, you got a shot at that deer.
Yeah.
Now it didn't work.
It's unreal. And it's so funny because going back to when we were first learning a lot of this, when we talked to Jake, and he's like, oh, if I get one picture of a deer, I'm jacked. And I'm like a week or a day? And no. Yeah, I know he's in there if I get a picture of him. And sure enough, everything we've come to figure out has kind of proven that for the most part. And then looking at that study, I mean, you're not going to just get that deer all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
all right.
If I get a couple pictures of a buck, especially early season, I'm ecstatic because I'm like,
yeah,
all right, we're fairly close. Sorry,
I'll share one more example of a similar thing but different. So this buck, this is his movements in year one. Okay, and I'll say this for everyone out there listening: do not be getting any ideas. These bucks have been dead for years. It's not like you're going to go in there and find this buck doing this again. So you're welcome to go find this road on the map, but this buck is not going to be there anymore. And this is private land, and we will send the game wardens after you. All right, I digress. So this buck is I would say this buck is on a food cover pattern, right? You can tell his bedding areas are concentrated here. This is one of his favorite areas. This is still going to be about 15 acres right here in and of itself. But he is traveling very consistently to this soybean field pretty much every day. But he is accessing it here. He's accessing it here, a lot here. He is all over this field. It's not like he is using a super well-defined travel corridor going from food to cover. The last buck I show you was about as defined as it gets, and that was still, his travel corridor was still about 500 yards wide. This one is much less defined, and it is way wider than that, and he is using it, I would say, almost uniformly. When I say uniformly, I mean there's very little preference for this trail or that trail to get to his food source. He is using, all over. He's crossing this road at all sorts of different points to get to this food source. So The point with that is hanging a trail camera in here, you would have even less of a chance to get that buck repeatedly, but it certainly doesn't mean that he's not in the area. But
Yeah.
you know, if this is the buck you're targeting, you know, good luck. I mean, it's going to be hard getting him inside bow range.
Wow.
Yeah.
I agree.
Now let's look at his year 2 data. So that was year.
Oh.
So blue is year 1. Okay. Now I'm going to overlay year 2 on top of it. Look how similar that is. He is
Gee.
doing almost exactly the same thing in year 2 as he was in year 1. So if I'm going to toggle back to year 1, we're going to zoom in on this area. This area right here is definitely his preferred area to bed. All of these little clusters right here, these are all bed sites.
That's what
And
I
you
was
can
gonna
tell
ask.
he visited this one time. He bedded there for probably, I'm just counting the number of points, probably about 2 hours. He got up and left. He visited this one, it looks like twice, this one twice. A lot of these he only visited one time. I mean, look at these. Bed there once, bed there once, bed there once, there once, there once. This one probably twice, that one twice. But now look at some of these. He bedded in this little area
Lots of time.
inside a 10 or 20-yard radius, probably close to a dozen times. In this area, he bedded a couple dozen times. So that's year 1. Let's toggle off year 1 and put in year 2. And we see that this area is 100% still his favorite bedding area relative to year 1. But the lower area, he's hardly using this area right here at all. Blue, again, is year 1. Pink is year 2. When we just look at year 2, he's using this area a little bit, but not near as much as he was year 1. But he's still using this area a lot. And so my take-home point with all of this is one of my pet peeves, especially since doing a lot of this buck bedding research, is when hunters say, "Oh, I'm going to go hunt his bedding area," as if he has one bedding area. Bucks do not have one bedding area. And if you count this whole 60-acre area right here as a bedding area, then sure, he's got one favorite bedding area. But he has got dozens of individual bed sites distributed throughout that bedding area. So the take-home point with all of this is that if you can find a buck in his, I use bedding area loosely, but in his favorite bedding area that is often going to be 10 to 50 acres in size, he will, if he is still alive the following year, 9 times out of 10, based on our data, that will be his favorite bedding area the following year. They have very high fidelity to their favorite bedding areas. Now let's kind of look at that from a different angle. So when we did all of our, and I think we talked about this some on the last time we recorded this podcast, but when we look at all of the individual beds that a buck uses, all of the individual bedding areas, well over 50% of those beds are used, or those bedding areas, are used less than 5 times. The vast majority of bedding areas are used less than 5 times, and about 50% of bedding areas are only used once. Okay. Now, on the flip side of that, about 2 or 3% of a buck's bedding areas are used many, many, many times. So this bedding area right here is a good example of the one that is used many, many, many times. But this bedding area, and the way we defined a bedding area for the study, just for some context, is a bedding area is classified as an individual or an individual bed or a group of beds that are separated from all other beds by at least 100 yards. So an individual bedding area has got to be at least 100 yards from any other bed. So this is obviously his favorite bedding area, and he's using it very repeatedly. But if you look at all of these, he's only visiting these beds one time. It'd be easy if you had a camera in here to get it bedded down and be like, "Oh, that's his bed." But he was only there once. He never came back to there again.
Yep.
And I'm just these points here are just from the month of October. So it's not, if we layered on September and November and December and January and into the rut, this would look very different. This is just 1 month of movement data from one buck.
Have you guys ever ran any of your studies on collared bucks in places with pretty good terrain, like not quite mountainous, but fairly?
No, not in Mississippi. And the areas that I've been showing y'all are, I mean, a 3-foot ridge is topography.
Sure.
What we're talking about, you know,
Sure.
this it's very flat, and I fully recognize and appreciate that if you threw topography into the mix, a lot of these movement patterns would probably change. You could almost certainly take a travel corridor that's 500 yards wide in flat topography and throw a ridge or two in there and probably condense that to 1 or 2 travel corridors that are each 50 yards wide.
It's very interesting going from even here in Ohio, because we're kind of like on the brink of like flat ag, and then you get down by the Ohio River and everything's fairly steep, and then we've actually got the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, so you can get into pretty much anything you want. And when you hunt ag, it's very interesting because the deer operate on the wind, and they'll bed literally anywhere. You pop them up anywhere, and there's not as much consistency. Then you start getting into that steeper terrain, and it at least makes it a little more consistent. But I do agree, like, I don't think that a deer has like 1 or even 3 beds. Clearly they don't. But it is interesting where they have those preferred areas. And during the early season, you can almost bet, like, if you ever come up to Ohio, I would love to just show you in person, because I could literally take you to a spot and I can let you watch the same buck come out of the same spot every night, every single night. It's very rare that you go there and don't see the big mature bucks. But as soon as the pressure comes, game over. We're done. And they leave. So I was just wondering about that. My other question to you, before I forget, getting into the Western hunting, I learned a lot about thermals, and that helped me really dive into it, and start asking questions here. There's something that I see people do when they're hunting mule deer that kind of has my interest. Everybody talks about that second bed. Don't go after him when you see him bed down first. Wait until he gets up and shifts into that second bed. Do you find whitetail, and this is morning, do you find whitetails doing the same thing in the morning where they'll bed and then get up, shift, and go, 20, 50, whatever yards, maybe a longer ways?
No, but I've never specifically looked at that. So
Okay.
that very well may happen. I've never looked at that in our data, and I've never noticed it in our data. I'm trying to think of any examples. It seems like normally when bucks are leaving their, let's say it's 5 a.m. and it's time for them to leave wherever they've been feeding all night and head back to their bedding area, they usually make a pretty much straight line distance, 500, 1,000 yards, whatever, get to their bedding area and bed down for at least a couple hours. I mean, that's certainly the average duration in their bed, and they will routinely get up throughout the day and mosey around and bed somewhere else, but it seems like it's usually at least a couple hours in that first bed.
Okay. Oh, absolutely. So I've got a specific spot where I feel like I'm watching deer move from one bed to the next, but it's not like we're 20 yards over here. It's literally mid-morning, 10, 11 o'clock in the day, and they're moving. And what's interesting is they're walking closer to the access every single time. And it's now we're into our second season looking at it, and it's the same thing again. And it's just kind of cracking me up. So I wanted to ask about that.
Yeah. And that is a very interesting point that is very volatile in terms of trying to hunt around that. When you are on the X, and I use the term X kind of loosely too, when you're in a buck's bedding area where he likes to spend the majority of his time, bucks do not, I've never, in the history of me looking at GPS data and the history of me talking to other researchers who look at GPS data, I don't want to say never, because I'm sure it does happen, but very rarely does a buck get into his bedding area, bed down, and stay bedded until
Sure.
nighttime when he gets up
Right.
and leaves again. He is up moving around all day long. He'll bed
Yeah.
down for 20 minutes, get up, feed around, bed down again somewhere else, get up, feed around. Obviously, we like to spend our time hunting when we have the greatest return on our investment, and deer are on their feet the most, making those long straight line distance movements. That's when you're going to have the most consistent success if you're in a travel corridor area. If you can get in that 10-acre bedding area and you're in there from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m., you will very consistently see bucks moving in the middle of the day. Now, what's the issue with that? It's being in there in the middle of the day and not getting busted, getting in, getting out, the thermal switch that's happening in that late morning to early afternoon time frame. It can be very difficult to do it, but if you can do it with access, with wind, topography, if you feel like you have a pretty good tab on where a buck is spending his time, you can have tremendous success in the middle of the day in those areas. It's a little more, it's high risk, high reward.
You're exactly right. It's that.
Yeah. I have debated, and I've talked to Chris about this, because a lot of people will do like all day sits during the rut, obviously. But man, I've really considered early season if I know there's a buck that really likes a certain bedding area. And it could be like, on this whole ridge that has had that's been cut or burned or whatever. I've really been debating on, man, maybe I should just throw an all day sit early season and just see if I catch them moving midday when hunters are, getting out 9, 10, see if I can just see him moseying through. I think that would be very effective. It's just a matter of sitting all day in 95-degree weather, and that doesn't sound appeasing at all. But you are absolutely right. To access those areas it's extremely tough, and I think that's part of the reason why you find some of these big deer in those areas. But going to the point of the theory of possibly a second bed or getting up and moving to one, I feel like we hear that a little bit more often when there is terrain involved. Like when you get, mid-morning and you get kind of those day winds that pick up, or let's say there's a hillside that has been shaded for most of the day, so the thermals are dropping, and then now the sun is up high enough to where it's beating down on it, and you get kind of a thermal switch, and they're going up the hill now. I feel like a lot of the people that we talk to anecdotally have talked about them shifting to a second bed around that time, because maybe the scenting conditions are a little different, and there's switching beds maybe from a predator avoidance standpoint or something, right? Sure. To a different area that gives them a better advantage. That's all kind of anecdotal and in theory, right? But
sure.
Luke, this has been an awesome conversation. We've gone down some rabbit holes that I was hoping we would get to, and it has been a lot better than this little bit semi-rigid format that I have written down. So I always appreciate having you on.
Absolutely. It's been fun.
We're getting a little long on this, so I don't want to take up too much of our listeners' time or too much of your time. In that buck move, we already kind of hit on some of the bedding area stuff that I was going to hit on. And we've got about halfway through some of the charts and stuff on that buck movement article. If we were to go a little bit further down in some of the figures, it gets into some other data that we've already hit on, like figures 12 and 13 hit on like time spent and behaviors by day and time spent and behaviors by month, which pretty much shows the same thing we've been discussing, right? Early season, they are bedding more, moving less, but they're also feeding more. So I think some of the data shows they're spending more time feeding than compared to like peak rut, right? Because they're moving around doing some breeding. So it just again kind of echoes what we've been talking about when these bucks are in these certain areas with like high forage and stuff. They'll be kind of localized, so to speak, and it can vary by buck. But if you're able to hone in on these areas where they have high fidelity it can lead to high success, as we heard in Chris's conversation in the last episode. So are there any other specifics, Luke, that you would like to go over as far as early season buck movement?
I mean, we could spend all day breaking apart all sorts of different patterns. I one of the things that I think is the most fun with this movement data, I mean, early season is a lot of fun because they're predictable. The rut is fun because they're unpredictable, and you're likely to, who knows what's going to happen during the rut. I mean, it's a wild card. I mean, anything could happen. But I think it'd be fun to have this conversation again in y'all's time frame. That's going to be late November, early December. Our time frame, that's going to be late January, early February. But there is some really interesting stuff we can dive into with late season buck movement as well. And I think that would be a fun follow-up conversation to kind of complement this on the other side of the rut.
Absolutely.
Hell yes.
I definitely agree. The late season is something that I am personally not great with because I really haven't attempted to hunt late season. Usually I'm done by then. It is a weakness, I would say, and my hunting strategy and all that. So it's definitely something I want to dive into and look at the research, because the research, the more I dive into it and the more articles I read, the more biologists I talk to, it lines up so well with what I see the more I'm out there, especially hunting public lands and stuff. And part of the reason for this series is I want to show the listeners that there is a ton of good information out there. My learning about whitetails and hunting whitetails has transitioned more so from listening to anecdotal evidence from other hunters. There is value in that, but it has transitioned a lot more to learning deer behaviors, deer movement, how they respond to human intrusion and stuff like that. And I feel like that has led to more consistent success. So we just want to relay that to our listeners and help them be as successful as they can.
Yep.
So, Chris and Rick, do you guys have anything else you would like to add?
No, this has been a great conversation. Thanks for inviting me to it. It's been very eye-opening, and the movement data is fantastic. I love seeing every bit of that.
Yes. Yeah, it is awesome. So we're going to end it here, guys. Appreciate you listening and hanging on this long. Want to thank Luke for hopping on and chatting with us this long. I know these are very kind of nerdy sessions that can go on for a while. So we greatly appreciate your time.
It's been fun.
Where can people find some of the stuff that you're still doing with MSU Deer Lab?
Yeah, so just go Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, whatever, and just search MSU Deer Lab, and we're posting a lot of stuff about my specific area of expertise is a lot of habitat management stuff. So I spend a lot of time with food plots and prescribed fire and old field management. But when we start to get to this late summer to early fall time frame, we're going to start dumping a lot of this buck movement data into the feed. So just hop in, join along. There's always a riot and a party in the comment section. If you want to be entertained, grab your popcorn. So
This is not what I've seen the 3 days that I hunt a year.
That's awesome. Well, guys, this has been the Mobile Hunter Podcast, and this is the Whitetail Apprentice Series. I've been your host, Josh Sluck, and I've been joined by my co-host, Christopher Leppert and Rick Cates. Our wonderful guest today was Mr. Luke Resop. Thanks for tuning in. We'll catch you on the next one.